Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. For our main topic today, we're going to be talking about weight and balance, which is a subject all pilots need to fully understand, and we'll talk about a couple of weight and balance related accidents. Plus, we have a listener question. A listener wants to know whether to buy a slightly older 182 or a slightly newer one with the old version of the G1000, and you might be surprised at my recommendation. Now, last week in episode 147, we talked with author Mike Bush about aircraft ownership tips, so if you didn't hear that, you may want to check it out. And if you haven't done so already, please click the subscribe button in whatever app you're listening to us now. That helps other people find this show, and it's the only way that you're going to get each new episode of Aviation News Talk to download automatically to your phone as soon as it's released. And of course, it's free to do that, so just take a moment right now, click on subscribe. And speaking of free, this episode is totally free. It's listener-supported, doesn't cost you a dime, though it does take a lot of my time to produce, probably 1 to 2 days each week. And I'd love it if you join the 3 to 4% of listeners who support the show by donating via Patreon or PayPal each month via credit card. So after the show, if you've really enjoyed it and you found some value, show us your support. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. This week in the news, the FAA relaxes regulations for 3 months due to COVID-19, but the rules regarding flight reviews and instrument currency won't apply to most pilots. And Air Venture is no venture for this year. Bailout money for airports is being distributed very unevenly, and we'll tell you why. And finally, Han Solo is back in the news, but not in a good way. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org and also FAA.gov, the FAA issued a Special Federal Aviation Regulation, or SFAR, that provides blanket extensions of medical certificates and airman knowledge tests that would have expired between March 1st and May 31st to all pilots, regardless of the type of flying they do. Flight instructor certificates that would have expired between March 31st and May 31st and would have been renewed under requirements other than a flight instructor refresher course will now have a blanket certificate extension until June 30th, 2020. So all of this applies to pilots whose medicals, knowledge test, and flight instructor certificates would expire between March 1st and 31st. Otherwise, the following exceptions we're talking about have some limitations to them. If you need a flight review or you need to regain instrument currency extensions, the SFAR provides some relief, but not for most pilots, just those pilots who need to get back in the air to support the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. So if you're not doing that kind of flying, there is no grace period for an expired flight review or instrument currency. Now, the AOPA article didn't cover all those limitations, but here's what I learned by reading the SFAR. You can get extensions if your flight review is due or on instrument currency, but only for any operation that requires the pilot to hold at least a commercial pilot certificate that supports the continuity of essential commercial operations, which includes aerial observation of critical infrastructure, aerial applications such as crop dusting, private carriage of medical supplies and equipment, which are conducted under Part 91K and Parts 125, 133, and 137. Additionally, this relief applies to some operations conducted by pilots exercising private pilot privileges if they meet the following criteria. The pilot must have at least 500 hours of time as a pilot, of which 400 hours is PIC, and 50 of the PIC hours were accrued in the last 12 calendar months. The operation is incidental to business or employment. The operation is in support of family medical needs or to transport essential goods for personal use. The operation is necessary to fly an aircraft to a location in order to meet a requirement of this chapter. The flight is to transport essential goods and or medical supplies to support public health needs. For flights conducted by private pilots under this relief, no one can be carried on the aircraft unless that person is essential to the purpose of the flight, such as when transporting doctors for the purposes of providing medical care. The SFAR also extends to pilots conducting charitable medical flights for a volunteer pilot organization. If your flying does fall under one of these categories, then and only then, for flight reviews, the FAA is offering a 3 calendar month grace period for people whose flight reviews may expire between March 1st and June 30th if they meet the applicability requirements. A condition of eligibility for the extension is that the pilot must have been current in March 2020, logged at least 10 hours of pilot and command time within the 12 calendar months preceding the month the flight review was due in an aircraft for which the pilot is rated. Also, eligible pilots must complete the FAST Team online courses totaling at least 3 wings credits, and you can find those, by the way, at FAAsafety.gov. The courses must have been completed in January 2020 or later. Also, if you're doing flying under these very limited categories for coronavirus relief that we mentioned, the FAA will also provide relief for instrument recency. The SFAR extends to June 30th the requirement to be instrument current under FAR 61.57 for those who meet the applicability requirements. A pilot must have performed and logged within the 9 calendar months preceding the month of the flight 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures and tasks, and intercepting and tracking courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. An additional eligibility requirement is the pilot must have logged in the preceding 6 calendar months 3 instrument approaches in actual weather conditions or under simulated conditions using a view-limited device. So these special rules are of some help, but some of them, specifically the extension of flight review and instrument currency, only apply in a very limited number of flight categories. Now, I've provided a link to the 93-page order in the show notes, so if you go out to aviationnewstalk.com/148, or if you tap on the artwork on your podcast player, you can find the link there. From generalaviationnews.com, the FAA to temporarily reduce ATC tower hours. The FAA will temporarily reduce the hours of operation at approximately 100 ATC towers starting the week of April 27th in light of the dramatic reduction in air traffic caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The temporary reduction in operational hours is part of the FAA's Staffing to Traffic initiative, which has evaluated each of the country's FAA towers to determine how the dramatic decrease in air traffic since the pandemic reached the U.S. is impacting demand on FAA resources. On average, the total operational traffic count in the U.S. has declined 65% since the pandemic started. The FAA says about 100 air traffic control towers have been identified for reduced hours. And looking at the list here in California, we have a number of towers that were staffed typically until 9 or 10 o'clock at night, which are now only staffed until 4 p.m. And I've included a link in the show notes to the list of roughly 100 airports here in the U.S. which have reduced hours of operation. From WEAU.com, a congressman calls on FAA to suspend airport bailout payments until funding formula is changed. Airport managers across the country were shocked when they saw how much money each would be getting through a coronavirus bailout package. Many immediately looked at their neighboring airports and wondered what happened. They all had submitted paperwork that could qualify them for relief through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, but the amount they got seemed strange in some cases. There were small airports with no major air carrier commercial flights and only a few thousand passengers who were set to receive millions of dollars. Yet the larger airports in their regions with airliners flying in and out with hundreds of thousands of passengers are slated for far less. Everyone at this point agrees the varying disbursements come down to the federally approved FAA funding formula and the way it was implemented. But there is disagreement about whether the allocation should stand. Congressman Steve Cohen from Tennessee said the funding should not go out yet, calling the formula that caused the disparities flawed. He said the Senate wrote the formula in a way that favored small airports, some to the tune of $17 million or more. Cohen said there were a lot of inequities and a lot of windfalls. In a letter to FAA, Cohen asked the agency to stop the funding and cited earlier reports in April that illustrated differences between some airports' planned CARES funding. Some airports are set to receive the equivalent of decades' worth of funding, others just a few months. Cohen said, "It came in that if you didn't have any debt, you got basically $18 million, give or take. They did the formula to where it would benefit small airports, but that didn't have many passengers." The FAA's formula incorporated 3 factors from 2018 records: the number of passengers who flew in and out, the airport's debt, and how that number compared to cash reserves. The House, Cohen explained, wanted the funding to be used only on passenger numbers, but the Senate wanted to incorporate debt as a measure. For some 24 airports, such as the one in Knox County, the FAA will initially award approximately 4 years' worth of operating expenses. Then the airport can apply to get the rest and use it on capital improvement projects, which is something critics like Cohen disagree with. Quote, "The purpose should be entirely to help airports that have lost revenue to the coronavirus. Passenger decreases that result in less collections of taxes, passenger fees that airports rely on, folks that have kiosks or stores in the airport, employees that were laid off," Cohen said. And he gave some examples. For example, in Pullman, Washington, the airport allocation is $18.1 million, That's the equivalent of 22 years of operating expenses. Across the border in Idaho, the airport in Lewiston is on deck for a $1.2 million distribution, the equivalent of 1.6 years of operating expenses. The exact formulas used remain somewhat secret. Airport managers themselves are not completely sure what happened, and the FAA has not responded to Investigate TV's numerous requests for comments and explanations. What is known from limited FAA documentation and industry experts is the formulas were applied across the entire country using the same data sets from the same year. It just benefited some airports more than others. And I did find a list of all airport grants that have been announced and their dollar amounts, and I'll include a link to that in our show notes. And from AOPA.org, flight plan errors could be costly. More than one-third of pilots are not filing IFR flight plans correctly when it comes to entering their aircraft's ADS-B equipment information, the FAA says. One field is completely incorrect on 35% of flights. In certain airspace, incorrectly filed ADS-B capability could result in a significant change to either the route of flight or the requested altitude. 3 fields in the ICAO flight plan form, which the FAA now use for both domestic and international flight plans, support ADS-B-based air traffic control services. And they reference here Field 18 SUR/. They say it's filed correctly only 65% of the time. If you're equipped with 1090 ES, that field should specify 260B. They say that callsign mismatch also continues to be a problem for flights operating under designated callsign and receiving ATC services. The ADS-B flight ID must match the callsign filed in the flight plan. For most GA operations, of course, the callsign is simply the aircraft's N number. Beginning in December 2019, volunteer pilots for charitable and humanitarian organizations can no longer use callsigns based on the aircraft's registration number. Instead, the pilot must contact his or her volunteer flying organization and be issued a unique callsign that's assigned to the pilot and not the aircraft. The FAA has flight plan resources available online. Pilots can also email the FAA with questions. Yeah, this is definitely an old story I remember from 8 years ago. Don't mess with GPS. That's the message AOPA members want the Federal Communications Commission and Congress to hear loud and clear in proceedings that would revive a wireless network proposal long criticized by aviation groups as a hazard to navigation. Countless other GPS users who depend on digital technology, along with the Department of Transportation and the Department of Defense, are on the same wavelength as a battle over bandwidth that drove a network company into bankruptcy in 2012 reignites in Washington, D.C. On April 20th, the FCC voted to approve a proposal by Legato Networks that revives the plan by network venture Light Squared to establish a land-based 5G network on L-band frequencies close enough to those used by GPS to create potential interference with navigation. The agency issued a news release announcing the unanimous vote of its 5 members to approve the network that will, quote, primarily support 5G and Internet of Things service. The announcement noted that regulators included stringent conditions to prevent harmful interference. Quote, the order also requires Legato to protect adjacent band incumbents by reporting its base station locations and technical operating parameters to potentially affected government and industry stakeholders prior to commencing operations, continuously monitoring the transmit power of its base station sites, and complying with procedures and actions for responding to credible reports of interference, including rapid shutdown of operations where warranted. On April 21st, the Department of Homeland Security issued a statement noting that it had recommended that the FCC deny the Legato application and reiterating its concerns about the proposal's impact on GPS. And essentially the issue here is, at least from my perspective as an electrical engineer, is that anytime you have strong signals transmitting on a frequency that are close to another frequency, which is the case here, you can have interference in the adjacent channel, even if you're not transmitting on that particular frequency. It's particularly an issue because the signals coming from GPS satellites are extremely weak. And so it doesn't take much of a strong signal here on the ground to cause interference to those signals. And from EAA.org and an email that was sent to all EAA members late last week, CEO Jack Pelton announced the cancellation of Air Venture 2020. He said, we don't gamble, we need a sure thing. As your leader, I see no clear path to meet our own requirements to ensure the health and safety expectations our organization demands for our employees, members, volunteers, exhibitors, and attendees. That includes sanitization, separation, and personal protection requirements. My conclusion is, like in any good flight planning, don't take that risk. Therefore, I have no choice but to cancel Air Venture 2020. Together, we can come back stronger, safer, and ready for Air Venture 2021 and create a memorable world-class aviation event. Because of our dedicated and enthusiastic EAA members, our association is strong. We know that at some point this storm will pass, and over the next 12 months, we will continue to support all of you as we again together grow EAA in the spirit of aviation. And from AINonline.com, jet deliveries halved, profits plunge in Textron's Q1. Deliveries, revenue, and profits plunged in the first quarter at Textron Aviation as the Wichita airframer wrestled with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and, to a lesser degree, the December accident at its composite manufacturing plant. The manufacturer of Beechcraft and Cessna delivered 23 Citation jets and 16 turboprops, compared with 44 jets and 44 turboprops in the same quarter last year. So those numbers are roughly half or even less than half. And they said that led to a $262 million decline in revenue to $872 million and an even sharper fall of $100 million in profits to just $3 million for the quarter. Backlog at the end of the quarter was down to $1.4 billion from $1.7 billion at the end of Q4 in 2019, said Scott Donnelly, president and CEO of parent company Textron. And he attributed that to a revised demand outlook from fractional operator NetJets. Quote, they're still taking quite a few deliveries this year on both Latitude and Longitude, which would be the largest business jets made by Cessna. Donnelly explained during an earnings call, he said, but they also said, look, until we see the sales turn back on for other aircraft that we expect to take delivery on this year, we're going to take those out of the book. Looking ahead, Donnelly said there's still a great deal of uncertainty about demand for the remainder of the year because Textron is unable to get its sales force out to talk with customers. We just don't have good visibility into what the production rate needs to be for the balance of the year, he said. We always gauge that based on looking at our sales team and understanding order flow and what's going on in terms of the normal progression of customers moving from query to taking an order. And we don't have that right now. We're basically doing furloughs to buy time to get the economy to start to pick up, to be able to travel and to understand where we are so we can gauge what we need to do to set that production rate for the balance of the year. And from jetsuite.com, which is the website for JetSuite, JetSuite Air has voluntarily filed for relief under Chapter 11 of the bankruptcy code for the District of Delaware, according to their Chief Restructuring Officer, Ted Gavin. He said JetSuite has always done its best to honor its commitments to customers throughout its exemplary history, and JetSuite leadership has spent and will continue to spend enormous time in effort pursuing strategic and financial alternatives to restart operations. Unfortunately, the global circumstances brought in by COVID-19 have caused JetSuite's revenues to drop to near zero, and the carnage across the economy and in the aviation industry in particular is well reported and has no clear end in sight. So we've made the regrettable but necessary decision to file for Chapter 11. JetSuite has safely operated over 100,000 flights since 2009. It will seek bankruptcy protection to reorganize, preserve, and maximize the value of its assets and potentially resume operations. Now, JetSuite was almost like a miniature airline. Here in California, they connected a lot of smaller cities with small aircraft with reasonable fares. And if you ever heard the call sign Red Stripe, well, then you were listening to a JetSuite pilot. They provided a great service, and they'll definitely be missed. And from AOPA.org, the FAA issues first medicals to professional pilots with insulin-related diabetes. The FAA has approved the first medical certificates for professional pilots who depend on insulin to control their diabetes, a policy years in the making that builds on the success of a similar policy for private pilots. Following several years of literature review, analysis, and consultation with diabetes experts, the FAA has issued medical certificates under special issuance authorization to the first commercial pilots who use insulin to treat diabetes. These new issuances are the result of an exhaustive process of review of data, particularly the technology and accuracy of continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM, which has significantly improved diabetic patients' blood glucose control. CGM was a key factor in the FAA's decision to publish the policy announcement in late 2019. AOPA was a strong proponent in 1996 for the change that led to the establishment of a policy allowing special issuance of third-class medicals to private pilots with insulin-dependent diabetes. The policy has been quite successful, and the requirements for commercial pilots, though robust and comprehensive, incorporated elements of the third-class medical policy, including treadmill stress testing for applicants over age 40, comprehensive eye examination, and periodic reports of A1C hemoglobin, in addition to the new requirement for CGM. And finally, from theNewYorkTimes.com and just about every tabloid in the world, the FAA investigates Harrison Ford and his plane again. The single-engine airplane had just landed at Hawthorne Municipal Airport outside LA when the tower instructed a pilot to wait for another aircraft to make a touch-and-go landing before taxiing across the runway. Unfortunately, he didn't wait. And it wasn't just another pilot. Yep, it was actor Harrison Ford, who made the miscue on Friday around 3:20 p.m. Mr. Ford, 77, immediately owned up to the error, which was not the first time he had run afoul of flight control rules or been involved in an aircraft accident. While there was no danger of a collision, according to FAA, the agency said it was investigating the episode. Mr. Ford had just landed on runway 25 at the airport in his Aviat Husky when the tower instructed him to hold his position. A two-seat gyroplane had been cleared for a touch-and-go landing on the same runway, which runs east to west. Mr. Ford's plane and the other aircraft were about 3,600 feet apart when he strayed onto the runway, according to the FAA. And here's what that sounded like.
Husky 9 Hotel, uniform, disregard. For spacing, runway 25, have a normal base turn. Wind 2507, swiftly clear to land.
Sorry, that first part was garbled, sir. Would you say again?
Husky 9 Hotel, uniform, make a normal base turn, runway 25, wind 2607. Clear to land.
8 Hotel uniform.
Gyro 8 Echo Alpha, number 2, follow Husky, left base, runway 25, wind 2707, swiftly option.
Follow the Husky, clear for runway number 25, number 2, 8 Echo Alpha.
Husky 9 Hotel uniform, turn left Delta, runway 25, taxi is 0, with me.
Okay, left on Delta, taxi on 0 with you, sir.
Hawthorne Tower, Cirrus 816 Charlie Tango is inbound on the practice localizer with payback.
Cirrus 816 Charlie Tango, roger, continue inbound, runway 25, wind 270 cleared to land.
Clear to land 25, 6 Charlie Tango.
Husky 9 Hotel uniform, pay attention.
GBH.
Husky 9 Hotel uniform, hold short, runway 25 at hotel.
Hold short at 25 at hotel for 8 Hotel uniform. 8 Hotel uniform, hold short at hotel.
Hotel uniform, can you hold short runway 25, traffic on the runway.
Crossing 25. 8 Hotel uniform.
9 Hotel uniform, get across that runway now. I told you to hold short. You need to listen up.
Excuse me, sir. I thought exactly the opposite. I'm terribly sorry.
8 Hotel uniform, that's on you.
I am, sir.
9 Hotel uniform, I'm so sorry about this. A possible pilot deviation. When you get a chance, give me, you got the phone number to call the tower up here?
I'll take it now.
All right, number is 310-675.
Be right there.
08 Echo Alpha, wind 250 at 9. Remember to phone the Cirrus, very, very short sauna. Runway 25, clear to the option.
Clear for the option. Runway 25, 8 Echo Alpha.
Now, it's quite possible that Mr. Ford got caught by expectation bias, where we hear what we expect to hear and not what's said. For example, after we've been told to hold short, you might expect that the next transmission will be to cross the runway, not to have the hold short instruction repeated a second time. But often ATC repeats hold short instructions, so we have to listen to each transmission and be careful not to hear what we expect to hear. Anyway, this article continues with a litany of all the times Mr. Ford has been in the news for various accidents and incidents, and although he made a serious error last week, I'm very sympathetic toward him because when you and I make an error, well, we don't have to worry about it being reported as national news. Of course, Mr. Ford will have to talk with the FAA about this, and most likely he'll be required to get some remedial flight instruction with a CFI, which is what I would expect to happen with any pilot who made a similar error. And I just went back and listened to the tape again, and I realized the controller added to the confusion with an improper instruction. If you listen closely, he did not tell the pilot to hold short as he later insisted he had done. Instead, he asked a question. He said, "Hotel uniform, can you hold short of runway 25 traffic on the runway?" So in this case, I would say there were errors on both sides, and hopefully the FAA takes that into account. Also, my thanks to liveatc.net for that audio. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then on to our main topic, which is weight and balance. all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's kick things off with a fun flying destination from Patreon supporter Dave Eikenberry.
Hello, Max. My name's Dave Eikenberry, and I'd like to share my fun flying destination. It's Everglades Air Park, identifier X-Ray 01. Everglades is located south of Naples and Marco Island, Florida, in the northwest corner of the Everglades National Park. The strip is 2,400 feet of asphalt in good condition. There's 2 parking spots in the middle of the field, but there's more parking on the grass if needed. And they have very inexpensive self-serve fuel. Once you're parked, there are bicycles available to ride into town about a mile away. And there are a handful of restaurants there, including 2 that were still open for takeaway service. We ate at City Seafood right on the water just a few weeks ago and really enjoyed it. There are several airboat rides which go into the Everglades, including private tours if that's what your preference is. Perhaps the highlight of the trip, though, was a seafood establishment called Grimm's. It turns out that Everglades City is located in some of the best harvesting areas for stone crab, and they service many of the restaurants in the country. If you call Grimm's in advance, they'll deliver whatever quantity of stone crab you would like on ice. They'll take it right to the airport so you can fly away. Happy flying.
Dave, that was great. Makes me hungry. Wish I could go there right now. And if you have a fun flying destination that you'd like to share, do what Dave did. Go ahead and take your smartphone, look for the Voice Memos app, and then go ahead and record 60 to 90 seconds about your favorite airport, and then email it to me here at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. Also wanted to mention that we heard from Patreon Jonathan Weisswasser. He writes, I made a video for my YouTube channel of me flying my RV-8 from Newark to LaGuardia to JFK, which I think you might enjoy. I believe I may be the only person to have brought an experimental to all 3 in one sortie. It was an eerie feeling being the only aircraft over Manhattan. Hope you enjoy it. And I thought the video was spectacular. It was a nice, clear day. The skyline of New York was really fun to look at. I used to live in New York a number of years ago, so it was just kind of fun seeing that. Jonathan, thanks so much for sharing that, and I'll put a link in the show notes so you can watch his video. Also, I saw something interesting here. A couple of years ago when I was at Air Venture, I met student pilot Trevor Simoneau, who has started a little company called Chart It All. He was 15 at the time, and he sells a lot of different things with sectional charts printed on them. And what I saw was that they are selling masks, which have a sectional chart on them. So I think I may order one of these. They're $15 if you choose one of the 4 standard airports they have, or you can get a custom mask with your airport on it for $30. And that's at chartitall.com. Trevor, by the way, was 15 when I met him, so quite the entrepreneur. And here's an email I got via LinkedIn from Arpad Sizikal. He says, Hi, Max. I hope you're keeping well and safe during these difficult times. I thought I'd let you know, together with the Royal Aeronautical Society's Careers and Skills team, we're putting together a career planning during an industry downturn webinar series, one aimed at young professionals and another for more seasoned executives in the industry. Below is the link to the webinar page. Looks like the first of these occurs on the 6th of May, but go ahead and look for a link to that in our show notes. And a couple of weeks ago, I went and subscribed to IFR Magazine at ifr-magazine.com. No, I don't have a relationship with them. In fact, as you know, we don't have any outside sponsors on the show. But with some of my free time the other day, I read 2 articles that they published in recent issues, the March and the April issue, on Skew-T. Now, if you're not familiar with Skew-T, you probably do know that the National Weather Service releases balloons twice a day from about 100 locations around the United States. Attached to those balloons is a radio sonde, which sends back temperature and dew point information as they go up through the atmosphere. And of course, that information is marked by the altitude that it's at. And you can think of Skew-T as a plot of those 2 pieces of information, temperature and dew point, versus altitude. And actually, it's not altitude, but it's different pressure levels, which roughly equate to altitude. Now, you can use Skew-T charts to figure out where you have an inversion layer, at what level you have clouds existing, and even where you're likely to encounter clear air turbulence, which was news to me. Now, I have tried to learn about SKU-T a couple of times in the past and failed. It's pretty complicated, and I haven't really found any great articles on it on the internet. So I highly recommend that. I think we'll probably try and bring someone on the show here sometime in the future to talk about SKU-T. One app that I have seen that takes that data and plots it out and basically shows you how high the clouds are and what the different cloud layers are is the AeroV app that I've talked about in the past. They were just purchased back in late March by Apero, and those are the makers of the Stratus ADS-B receivers that many pilots have, and they have rebranded the AeroV app as Stratus Insight. So we'll talk more about SKU-T in the future. Now, in our last episode, we talked with Mike Bush, and Mike mentioned something that had just happened, which was someone tried to perpetrate a scam to sell an aircraft they didn't own. And I just saw an article in QZ.com, that stands for quartz.com, about someone else who's doing exactly the same scheme. So apparently there are multiple people trying to do this. The story says that the thief registered his new airplane, which he didn't own, with the FAA last February. He submitted all the necessary paperwork, including a signed bill of sale showing that he had bought a 1981 Piper Seminole from a private seller for $115,000. Although the return address on the envelope didn't match the address listed on the registration, Hughes included the standard $5 registration fee, and everything seemed in order. A couple of weeks later, the FAA Registry Office officially transferred ownership of the aircraft over to Hughes. Now, shortly thereafter, he posted something on the aerotrader.com marketplace. He wrote, "I own a 1981 Piper PA-44 180T. He asked $125,000 for the plane. He says, I have proof of ownership in hand from the FAA. The plane is located at Shelton, Washington. The plane is well cared for and wants to find it a new home. I can even accept trades negotiated on the price." Now, the paperwork Hughes had sent to the FAA was phony, and that only came to light when a worker at the Washington Department of Transportation placed a routine call to the Piper's previous owner to confirm their cancellation of the plane's registration. Now, the owner was confused. He's a U.S. Navy doctor in Gig Harbor, Washington. He told them he hadn't sold the airplane and he didn't intend to. And an FAA official cited in the complaint told investigators that the agency, quote, takes all documentation at face value and does not question anything unless the applications are incorrectly completed or contain missing information. The official who declined Quartz's request for comment told DHS that he has seen other similar cases. So buyer beware, there are people scamming right now to sell your airplane for you. Of course, they're going to keep the money. And back in episode 146, in the update section, I read an email that was apparently from a FedEx pilot, though his name was not on it and had been forwarded on. And I did get an email from Don Dillman. He's one of our longtime Patreon super supporters. He said, "Hi, Max, I listened to 146 in your reference to FedEx pilots. I can speak to that subject. First, everything I heard in the message you read is true. Our pilots are doing a tremendous job around the world, not just in Asia Pacific, but also in the Middle East, where the pilots are still experiencing invasive testing," which I guess means that as they go in and out of the airports, they're required to take all kinds of medical tests. He says, "Plus the immigration and testing rules are in constant flux. I'll keep this message short, but could tell many stories. Bottom line, our folks are carrying hundreds of thousands of pounds of PPE, testing equipment, and medical supplies. In addition, they are keeping the global economy going by moving goods and services. We all think of airline flying as glamorous and exciting. What these folks are doing is essential and life-changing. I couldn't be prouder of them." Well, Don, thanks so much for taking the time to send this. And again, congratulations to FedEx and all the pilots around the world, regardless of who they're flying for, helping us here during the current pandemic. And speaking of people who are helping a lot, this is a listener-supported show, and our Patreon and PayPal supporters help a lot. And we have a very interesting new group of mega supporters who've just joined, so let me tell you about them. Bruce Dickerson, who's been with us since September, just edited his pledge up to $100 a month. He's a pilot from Georgia, and I took Bruce and his wife on a San Francisco Bay tour in a Cirrus when they were here 3 years ago. And Don Hakela is donating $50 a month. He's with Professional Instrument Courses. They do 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can find him at iflyifr.com. And Stephen Bush, also donating $50 a month. He's the owner of Lone Star Helicopters in Lago Vista, Texas. He mentions they do a lot of add-on ratings for pilots who want to go from fixed-wing to helicopter, and you can find them at lonestarheli.com. And finally, William Birch edited his pledge up to $50 a month. He's a doctor in Tennessee, and he recently wrote that he likes the new Flight Safety Detectives podcast. We also have many other new Patreons, and I want to thank Matthew Wallace. I apologize. Somehow I missed reading his name on a prior show, so I apologize for that. Also new to us are Timothy Drew, John Somiak, Jay Royal, Michael Jenichin, Skip Caddy edited his pledge up to $15 a month, Mike Albertson, Lucas Derry edited his pledge up to $20 a month, Brock Benjamin, Nina Abu Hussein, Nick Webb, Bobby Carr, Andros Medveski, Philip Nybert, Eric Hecht, Lukal LG, Philip Archambault, Eric Lichtenheld at $20 a month, Martin Kemp, and just this morning, Gary Mulligan. Thank you all so much for joining. We also have some new supporters via PayPal. George Welsh has become a regular new monthly contributor. Thank you very much. We've also had 2 large one-time donations, and I think that's because people like to just give a lump sum for the year rather than have to do a monthly donation. So thanks very much to Israel Niv for $420, and I've flown with Israel in the past. Thanks so much. And Mark Vrana, who donated $200. Thank you so very much. And for all of our mega supporters, people who donate $50 a month or more, I mention them on each of our news show, and they'll get one of my books after 2 months. Those mega supporters are Brian Deere, who lives here in Northern California and flies at Turbo 206, Tyson Weiss, co-founder of ForeFlight, Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus, Tim Delaney, flying out of Northern California in an SR20, Stephen Elop, who just helped me recently with a writing project. He flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's also CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composite, maker of composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircraft. Seth Lake, he's a DPE in Arkansas, also teaches multi-engine ratings. You can find out more about him at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he instructs in the Cincinnati area, both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center and with private students in Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcrafts, and Cicadas. Justin Winter, who brokers real estate on Lake Keowee in South Carolina and flies an SR22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, proud owners and operators of 3 Cessna T240 aircraft. Johnny McDade, singer, songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, who's teaching as a ground instructor at Republic Airport on Long Island, and he also does online coaching for aspiring pilots, and you can find him on his Facebook page called Ground Point 9. Charlie Mason, who flies out of Santa Monica in a Cirrus SR20. Vincent Salimi, he's council member for the city of Pinole, and he's owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco. Jim Hopp, who's a flight instructor at Advantage Aviation in Palo Alto. Lars Litjens, our youngest patron supporter. He flies a Redbird J Velocity. He's looking forward someday to being big enough to fly his dad's Cessna 205. Dad sells boats at boulderboats.com in several western states. Joseph Sheehan, he flew in the Navy for 8 years and has been flying for the past 3 years on an SR-22, and he's just about to pick up his new Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman, working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, a new AME, pilot medical examiner in Naples Municipal Airport. If you need a basic med, second or third class physical, you can find him at aviatorsclinic.com. Ted Panzishin, he's a student pilot who lives in northern Delaware, where he can watch airliners join the ILS 9 right for Philadelphia. And I'd like to thank these contributors as well as everyone else who supports the show in any way. Now in a moment, we're going to be talking about weight and balance right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about weight and balance. Understanding weight and balance is important for safe operation of an aircraft, and all student pilots are required to have ground instruction on the subject. It's covered in the FAA's Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge and in another FAA book called the Aircraft Weight and Balance Handbook, which is over 100 pages long. You can download both books for free as PDFs from the FAA.gov website. Now, let's talk first about weight. It's important that pilots understand that in most GA aircraft, it's just not possible to fill all the seats, load the baggage compartment to capacity, carry full fuel, and stay within the approved weight and balance center of gravity limits. In many airplanes, the fuel tanks may not be filled to capacity when you have a full load of passengers and baggage is carried. So often it will be necessary to reduce the number of passengers or the baggage weight if your proposed flight distance requires a full fuel load. The pilot should always be aware of the consequences of overloading. An overloaded aircraft may not be able to leave the ground, or if it does become airborne, may exhibit poor flight characteristics. If not properly loaded, the first indication of poor performance usually happens during takeoff. Now, there have been countless accidents in which excess weight was a factor. For example, on August 25, 2001, a Cessna 402 twin-engine aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff from Marsh Harbor Airport on Abaco Islands in the Bahamas, killing the pilot and all 8 passengers on board. Among the victims were American singer and actress Aaliyah and part of her entourage. The group had just completed filming of a music video and had chartered a flight to return to Florida. The subsequent investigation found the aircraft had attempted to take off while more than 700 pounds over max gross weight, and it was carrying one more passenger than it was certified for. As a pilot, you need to know that excessive weight reduces flight performance in almost every respect. For example, the most important performance deficiencies of an overloaded aircraft are a higher takeoff speed, a longer takeoff distance, reduced climb rate and climb angle, lower maximum altitude, shorter range, reduced cruise speed, reduced maneuverability, higher stall speed, higher approach and landing speed, and a longer landing ground roll. Also, you may have excessive weight on the nose wheel or the tail wheel. The pilot must also consider the consequences of an overweight aircraft if an emergency arises. If an engine fails on takeoff or airframe ice forms at low altitude, it's usually too late to reduce an aircraft's weight to keep it in the air. Though there was an accident I recall about 20 years ago in which witnesses saw a passenger throwing luggage from a 6-place single-engine aircraft after it took off from an airport in Southern California on a really hot day. Unfortunately, they could not lighten the aircraft enough and it crashed, killing all on board. By the way, gasoline is pretty heavy. It weighs about 6 pounds per gallon. So 30 gallons of fuel could weigh more than one passenger. But if you lower the aircraft weight by reducing fuel, the airplane's not going to fly as far, and you need to take that into account when flight planning. For example, if you're carrying a lot of people or cargo and you can't carry full fuel, you may have to stop multiple times en route and refuel more frequently than if you were flying with full tanks. I was talking with a new student pilot recently, and he said he would always fly with full tanks. So I explained to him that there are times when you might not want to top off the tanks before takeoff, such as taking off from a high-altitude airport. By taking off with less than full fuel, you'll get a higher climb rate, which may be important if you were to encounter a downdraft while flying in mountainous terrain. Now let's talk about the second part of weight and balance, which is balance. Balance refers to the location of the center of gravity, or the CG, of an aircraft, and it's important to stability and safety in flight. The CG is a point at which the aircraft would balance if it were suspended at that point. And as you might guess, there are limits, forward and aft limits to the CG in which you have to stay within. The limits are established by the aircraft designers to assure predictable aircraft control. For example, if all passengers are sitting in the front row, you have a more forward CG, and a forward CG limit is specified to assure that you have sufficient elevator authority whenever you're taking off and landing. Imagine you had a CG that was very far forward beyond the limit, and imagine trying to land and you couldn't get the nose to come up in order to flare to land. Or imagine trying to take off and not being able to get the nose to come up when you try to rotate. In both cases, it would be because you exceeded the forward CG limit and put too much weight in the front of the airplane. Now, conversely, if you put too much weight in the back of the airplane, which, by the way, is easy to do if you put heavy suitcases in the rear baggage compartment, then you're going to have an aft CG. And the aft CG limit is most critical during flight. As the CG moves further aft, the aircraft will become less stable in pitch, and the ability of the aircraft to right itself after maneuvering will be decreased. In the extreme, if your CG is too far back and the aircraft stalls, you might not be able to get the nose down to recover from a stall, which would be a pretty awful way to die. By the way, in some aircraft, the center of gravity can move a lot during flight as you burn fuel. For example, I recall several friends of mine who owned 6-place aircraft who never took more than 4 people on long trips. That's because on a long trip in this particular aircraft model, if they had 6 people on board, the aircraft would be within the CG limits at takeoff, but as the fuel burned over several hours, the aircraft's CG would move back behind the aft limit. But if they only took 4 people, The CG would be further forward when they took off and would remain within the CG limits for the entire flight. And by the way, here's a tip for student pilots. When you take your check ride for the private certificate, you'll be required to calculate a weight and balance for your plane for a hypothetical cross-country trip the examiner will have asked you to plan in advance. If you really want to impress the examiner and show that you really know your stuff, then calculate 2 weight and balances, one for takeoff and another for landing based on the reduced fuel load that you'll have when you reach your destination. Now, fortunately, there are a number of things that pilots can do if they determine ahead of time that the CG does not fall within the allowable limits. The best thing you can do is to shift the load around in the airplane before the flight. For example, you can move baggage and cargo around. There have been times when I've had a heavy suitcase, and instead of putting it in the rear baggage compartment, I've placed it instead on the back seat so I'll have a more forward center of gravity. As pilot in command, you get to decide where each of your passengers will sit, and if necessary, you do that based on how much each of them weighs. In general, you'll want to avoid putting really heavy people in the back of the airplane. So pilots have to get comfortable with asking passengers their weights, as you can't do an accurate weight and balance without that information. And in some airplanes with multiple fuel tanks, you can choose where to put the fuel you carry to better balance your load and keep the aircraft within its center of gravity limits. By the way, aircraft can crash when weight shifts in the aircraft after takeoff. In April 2013, a Boeing 747 crashed moments after taking off from Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, killing all 7 people on board. The investigation found that improperly secured cargo broke free during the takeoff and shifted to the back of the cargo hold. The change in balance caused the aircraft to pitch up and stall. And about 20 years ago, I flew a Piper Saratoga to Mexico to bring over 600 pounds of dental equipment to a free clinic that Los Medicos Voladores, or Flying Doctors, was setting up there. And I remember spending well over an hour tying the equipment down securely so there was no chance of it shifting in flight, as I knew if the equipment shifted during takeoff, the out-of-balance condition it would create could cause a crash. Now, the operational weight and balance limits for each aircraft are contained in the aircraft's approved flight manual, or AFM. For example, the maximum gross weight the aircraft is allowed to have at takeoff is specified. That's when the aircraft will be heaviest, unless you pick up ice in flight, which will make it heavier and give you an entirely new set of problems, which we talked about in detail in episode 110 and 111 of the Aviation News Talk podcast. The CG limits, both forward and aft, will also be specified in your aircraft's POH or AFM. And whenever you fly, you must have a copy of the weight and balance sheet for your aircraft in the plane with you. And that's not the page in the manual with generic weight and balance information. Every airplane has a different weight. Even 2 identical aircraft built one after another on the production line will have slightly different weights due to variations in the manufacturing and painting processes. So what you need in the airplane is a weight and balance sheet that's specific to your aircraft. It will list your aircraft end number on the sheet, and it will also list the exact empty weight of your aircraft. After the plane leaves the factory, if any work is done on the airplane that changes the weight of the aircraft, that sheet is going to be updated to reflect the changes in weight. If it's a simple change, such as pulling out an old radio and putting in a new radio model, the sheet will be updated by subtracting the weight of the old radio and adding in the weight of the new radio. Or, if it's a major structural change, mechanics will reweigh the aircraft and create a new weight and balance sheet for you to keep in the plane. Now let's talk about how to do a weight and balance calculation. Aircraft weight and balance is based on the laws of the lever and how shifting weights at various distances affects the balance point of a lever, or lever, depending on how you choose to say it. First, we need to be familiar with the terms arm and moment. The arm is usually measured in inches, and it refers to the horizontal distance between the center of an item or object, such as a passenger, and the datum, which is a common point from where all measurements are taken. Arms to the left of the datum are negative, and those to the right of the datum are positive. The datum is an imaginary vertical plane from which all horizontal distances are measured for balance purposes. The position of the reference datum varies by aircraft design and manufacturer. When the datum is located off of the lever and to the left, all of the arms are positive, which minimizes computational errors. For example, the datum on many Cessnas is at the firewall, so the arm to the engine and the oil would be negative since it's in front of the firewall, while the arms for passengers and fuel would be positive since they're behind the firewall. For a Piper Cherokee, The datum I just looked up in a POH was 78.4 inches ahead of the wing's leading edge, which put it right about the front of the spinner. And for Cirrus SR20T, the datum is actually a few inches in front of the spinner. So that's an arm, and now let's talk about what a moment is. A moment is a force that tries to cause rotation, and you calculate it by taking the weight of an object such as a passenger in pounds and multiplying it by the arm or the distance from the datum in inches. Moments are generally expressed in pound inches and may be either positive or negative. Let's talk about the law of the lever, and for this it's helpful to think of a child's teeter-totter that you might find on a school playground. You know those things. One kid sits on one end of a long board that's supported in the middle, and the second kid sits on the other end, and that middle support point is called the fulcrum or the pivot point. Now, the law of the lever states that a lever is balanced when the weight on one side of the fulcrum multiplied by its arm, so that would be the weight of kid 1 times the distance kid 1 is sitting from the fulcrum, is equal to the weight on the opposite side multiplied by its arm. In other words, the lever is balanced when the sum of the moments around the fulcrum is 0. This is the condition in which the positive moments, those which are trying to rotate the lever clockwise, are equal to the negative moments, those which are trying to rotate it counterclockwise. In an aircraft, the balance point is referred to as the CG, or center of gravity. To calculate the weight and balance for a particular flight, you first need to calculate the moments for the empty aircraft and add to that the moments for everything else that you add to the airplane, such as the pilot, the passengers, fuel, and baggage. And for some airplanes, such as the Cirrus SR20 with FICI, or flight into known icing capability, you also need to add the moment of the 72 pounds of de-icing fluid that the aircraft carries. So in essence, you're creating a spreadsheet. In the first column, you have the weight of the airplane and the weights of everything you're putting into the airplane. In the second column, you have all of the arms for each object, which is the distance of that object from the reference datum in inches. Fortunately, you don't have to measure those arms because they're all listed in the aircraft's AFM. For example, I just pulled up the POH for a Cessna 172R, which has the G1000, and it tells me that the arm for the rear passengers is 73 inches. But for the front passengers, it gives a range which is 34 to 46 inches. And that's not because some passengers are thicker than others, though of course they are. It's because the front seat can be moved 12 inches forward or backwards, and it suggests that 37 inches is the average position, meaning that most people have the front seat pulled up forward most of the way, which is certainly true in my experience. So in the first column, we have weights. In the second column, we have arms, and in the third column, we have moments, which we get by multiplying the numbers in column 1 by the numbers in column 2. So imagine the first row in our spreadsheet is for the empty airplane, the next row is for the front passengers, the next row is for the rear passengers, there's another row for fuel, and a final row for baggage in the rear baggage compartment. Once we have all the numbers filled in, then we add up all the numbers in the first column to determine the total weight in the aircraft. And we compare that number with the max gross weight specified for our aircraft to make sure we don't exceed that weight. For example, the max gross weight of the 172 we talked about is 2,450 pounds, and the SR20 is 3,600 pounds. Then we skip over column number 2 because you don't add the arms together, and go to column 3 where we add up all the individual moments together. And the sum of the moments can be a big number, over 100,000. Since when you multiply the weights by the arms to get the moments, you start getting big numbers. To make it easier, many aircraft AFMs take that large sum of the moments number and divide it by 1,000. For example, for the 172, if we divide the sum of the moments by 1,000, the acceptable range of the moments varies from about 52 pound-inches to about 115 pound-inches. And those small numbers are just a little easier to deal with. The final step with our spreadsheet is to calculate the center of gravity for the fully loaded plane. To do that, we take the sum of the moments, a number which might be around 100,000 for the 172, and divide it by the total weight, which could be as much as 2,450 pounds for the 172 AFM I'm looking at. That gives you a number that's somewhere around 41 inches, plus or minus about 6 inches. So we could actually physically take a tape measure 41 inches back from the firewall in a Cessna, and that would be where the center of gravity for our plane is located. The final step is to then compare these two numbers we've calculated, the total weight and the center of gravity, with a chart that graphs the acceptable range of these two numbers. For example, for the 172, we could have a CG as far forward as 35 inches, provided the aircraft was very light, no more than about 1,950 pounds. But as we add weight, the acceptable forward CG increases to the point where when we're at the max gross weight of 2,450 pounds, the CG can be no further forward than 40 inches. And for the 172 I'm looking at, the aft CG is 47.3 inches, regardless of weight. Now, I often have pilots express concern about their weight and balance point if it's near the edge of the graph, though still inside the graph. And it's important to remember that any point inside the graph is acceptable, so you don't need to worry if your point is near an edge of a graph, as long as it truly is inside the graph. Now, you should calculate a weight and balance every time you fly, but you can use some rules of thumbs for the planes you fly. For example, after looking at all of the numbers, you might conclude that for a particular plane you fly, if it's just you in the airplane, you can always fly with full fuel. But if that's your rule of thumb, anytime you have more than one person in the plane, you should then run a weight and balance calculation. Years ago, when I owned a turbo Cessna 210 with a partner, I realized I wouldn't do a full weight and balance calculation for each flight unless I made it easy to do. Now, that was 20 years ago, and at that time, I had an HP 200LX palm top PC that ran Lotus 123, and that thing fit in my pocket. So I created a spreadsheet so I could easily run the calculations and then see a graph and where on the graph my weight and balance fell. These days, most pilots carry a smartphone and often a tablet as well, as usually they're running an electronic flight bag app such as ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot. Both of these apps have a built-in weight and balance calculator which can do exactly the same thing. So if you're not using the weight and balance function in ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, I strongly urge you to set it up and start using it. By the way, as you step up into more capable turboprops and jet aircraft, and certainly if you take the written exam for the ATP certificate, you'll see a slightly different method used to express the center of gravity. Instead of calculating the CG in inches, you'll be doing it as a percentage of MAC, that's MAC, or percentage of mean aerodynamic chord. Essentially, this tells you how far back from the leading edge of the wing the center of gravity is located. And LEMAC and TMAC are two other terms you'll hear. LEMAC is the leading edge mean aerodynamic chord, and it tells you how many inches the leading edge of the wing is located from the datum. TMAC is the same thing, but for the trailing edge of the wing. So if the CG is at 0% MAC, that means it's located right at the leading edge of the wing. Or if the CG were at 100% MAC, that means it's located right at the trailing edge of the wing. So if your CG is, for example, at 33% MAC, then it's about a third of the way back from the leading edge of the wing. Using percent MAC helps a lot as pilots move from different length aircraft because it gives you an instant understanding of where the CG is located, regardless of how long your aircraft is. Also, there's a specific pitch trim setting for each percent MAC and airspeed combination, which makes it easy to set the pitch trim before takeoff if you've done the weight and balance calculation and you know the percent MAC for each flight. Well, there you have it, what you need to know about weight and balance. Coming up next, listener feedback, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to some listener feedback and also a listener question. This comes from Patreon supporter Cliff Farah. He says, you always talk about folks dying on their flight home in their prized new airplane. I think this has all the signs of that. You also say we are not inventing new ways of killing ourselves. It's the same stories over and over. And he sends a link to an article. First leg of the flight was from Texas to Oklahoma, and then later went on to the East Coast to Georgia, I believe. He said almost 10 hours of flying in one day, which is a long day, especially for one pilot with nobody else with him. Flight ends in hard, turbulent, single-pilot IFR late at night. Well, all of those are problems, especially the late at night. He says live AT shows the pilot having, quote, autopilot problems. Did he not know how to use his new autopilot in a pinch? That could be the case. He says the N number was reserved and not assigned. Did he pick up his new airplane in Texas earlier in the day? And at the end, he shows a link here where he said it looks like a classic graveyard spiral at the end. Well, that's unfortunate. But yes, for anybody who's buying a new airplane, you would definitely want to bring along somebody with you who is experienced in the type of aircraft that you're flying. Far too many stories like this where people go to buy their dream airplane but have an unfortunate ending. This comes from a Patreon supporter, Brian Martin. He says, hi, Max. Just wanted to shoot a note to let you know how helpful your podcast has been as I prepare for my instrument rating. Being stuck at home with all the COVID-19 restrictions, I've spent a lot of time studying, good way to spend your time, part of which has been combing through the internet for all resources. By far the most useful resource I've found so far was your mock instrument oral exam with Jason Blair. So great, Brian. I'm glad you enjoyed that. And this comes from Serge in New Brunswick, Canada. He says, "Hi, how are you in this disaster happening around the world? I'm praying for all of you in aviation. Here's a video of a superb landing in Quebec City. It's amazing. Thanks for reading this message. Your Canadian friend, Serge." And this you may have seen. I'll go ahead and post a link to it in case you haven't. It's a really well done landing of an aircraft on a highway who apparently had an engine failure. So he did a great job. And this just came in this morning from brand new Patreon supporter, Gary Mulligan. "Hi, Max. I discovered your podcast last fall and really enjoy the content. As a fairly new CFII, I'm 69 and retired. I try to pass on the information I've learned by listening to you to my clients while giving flight reviews and IPCs. I know it's a lot of work, and thank you for it." Well, Gary, thank you so much for that. And here's a listener question that came in from Chris Bercini, who's a new Patreon supporter. He said, "Hello, guru of the Garmin." That's cute. Thank you, Chris. I like that. He says, "I attended your seminar in Sacramento." He said, "I've been addicted to the podcast ever since the seminar." He said, "After extensive thinking, researching, and test flying, I've concluded a 182 would be a better plane for me. My budget allows the purchase of anywhere from a 1998 to a 2006 182. He says, "Which is better? Door number one, a 2004 182 with a 16-year-old G1000, or door number two, a 2003 182 with a new GTN 750 and GI 275 suite of digital gauges. Thanks." And I wrote back to him that the 2004 Cessna 182 is equipped with the older version of the autopilot, the CAP 140. Also, it lacks WAAS capability, so you wouldn't be able to fly LPV approaches with that aircraft. Plus, the cost to upgrade those older G1000s is relatively high if you wanted to get WAAS, and so most owners don't do it. And I told him, by contrast, the GTN 750 and GTN 650 are WAAS capable, so he'd be able to fly instrument approaches to LPV minimums, and he'd also have visual approaches, which is a favorite of mine. They let you create and fly a visual approach, including coupling it to the autopilot to any runway. Now, he didn't mention whether the 2003 included an autopilot. I'm guessing it has the CAP 140. I didn't know whether it will couple to visual approaches in the GTN 650, 750, but it might. So I told him that he might want to consider upgrading that aircraft with a G500 autopilot, which definitely would couple to the visual approaches, has indicated airspeed mode for constant airspeed climb, so you can't possibly stall if you were climbing with the autopilot. Also includes ESP for automatic corrections of mistakes you might make while hand flying, such as too steep a bank or too high of a pitch. And it has a level button. So Chris was very happy to get that. So Chris, thanks so much for sending your question. And a couple of quick reminders. If you'd like to support the show, head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, where you can sign up to make a donation either monthly or a one-time donation through the PayPal site. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends what a podcast is and how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. Frankly, that's the biggest challenge I find, is trying to find new listeners. So I really appreciate your help. And if the people you're talking with don't know what a podcast is, well, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, because everybody knows how to download an app. And that's where they'll find our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. So in those stores, just search for Aviation News Talk. And of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.